Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello and welcome to episode 94. It is blowing a gale and I forgot to put the radiator on in my office, so I'm sitting here in my big leopard print coat. If you know me in real life, you will recognise my Pat Butcher look. Big shout out today to all the Pod Dog listeners. Thank you so much to Victoria who sent me a picture of her in her Monday Night Review t-shirt with her very good boy. And I immediately started thinking about making dog merch, but I'm obviously not going to. But I love the thought of having pet listeners, so if you listen with your pet, hi to all the pets listening. I'm a crazy dog lady and I'm unashamed about it. We are going spooky today. So for those of you who need a spooky warning, this is it. I've just been speaking to Charlie. She's not going to be listening to this. She's never going to know that she's been mentioned. And she was saying how she has to mark the spooky ones as played so they don't automatically start playing and freak her out. For those who are going to listen but need a warning anyway, switch on some lights. Get your furry buddies cuddled up next to you. It's kind of scary. I also realise now that I have been finishing off the research for this morning, and my husband's away tonight. So, I mean, I'm hoping it'll be fine by the time I get there. I'm glad I didn't do what I initially thought I was going to do and record it tonight. It wouldn't make any sense. I would have to sleep with my light on. We're off to Kansas today. So we're going to set the scene. But first, my sources for this are loads. There's the visitatchison.com website, Wikipedia, obviously, the Astonishing Legends podcast. If you want a really thorough deep dive on this case, then the Astonishing Legends podcast is the one to listen to. They've got it in 4 parts, and the first part is 4 hours. I'm looking at part 4. This is 3 hours. It's from October and November 2018. So if you are going to go and have a look and a listen for that, if you really want a deep dive on this. So I've used that a lot because they are so incredibly thorough that it would be foolish not to. And because they went and visited it themselves, and I have to admit that I have not nipped over to Kansas to do the research for this. I would bloody well love to. But also, they were able to use the Pickman website, which was www.thesalliehouse.com, which seems to be no longer active. And I can't find why or what happened, or because Deborah Pickman basically, and Tony Pickman, who ran the website and who used to live in the house, did so much work on it, so much research, and now there's like nothing. I know that Deborah wrote a book. There's nothing. So go and listen if you want to. So we're going to Atchison in Kansas. We're starting in the mid-1800s, and when it's a small frontier town that was just beginning to develop, and it was founded in 1854 and quickly became an important hub for trade and transportation in the region. Now, I will say that obviously it was home to Native Americans before, and it was quite busy then. It's always had a lot of human inhabitants, and therefore human deaths. I feel like a lot of times people like to make a hoo-ha about there being sort of Native American burial grounds and everything, but it's just people have lived on the grounds, people have died on the grounds. That's that. So, in the 1850s, the town was home to a diverse group of people, including Native Americans, European immigrants, and African Americans. Many of the early settlers were involved in agriculture and livestock farming, and the town's location on the Missouri River made it an important centre for trade. Now, though it was small in size, Atchison was a bustling town with a lively economy. It had several hotels, saloons, and general stores, as well as a post office and a newspaper. And the town also had a reputation for being rowdy and lawless at times, with frequent clashes between different groups of settlers. Now, initially, Atchison was the centre of pro-slavery sentiment. Many residents were involved in the conflict known as Bleeding Kansas, a series of violent political confrontations taking place in Kansas Territory from 1854 to 1861. And the conflict arose from the debate over whether slavery should be allowed in Kansas, which was then a new territory seeking statehood. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 allowed settlers in Kansas Territory to decide whether to allow slavery or not, rather than having the decision made by Congress. And this led to a rush of pro- and anti-slavery settlers moving into Kansas, hoping to sway the decision in their favour. Now, things quickly turned violent, with both sides engaging in acts of intimidation, harassment and violence. Pro-slavery forces, who were supported by the government in nearby Missouri, formed armed bands known as Border Ruffians and attacked anti-slavery settlers and towns. Despite the violence and turmoil, the anti-slavery forces eventually prevailed, hurrah, in Kansas, and it was admitted to the Union as a free state in 1861. Atchison is also known as the birthplace of aviator Amelia Earhart, but though I may cover her in an episode one day, we're not here to talk about her. We're going to talk about a small, unassuming home called the Sallie House, which has become known as one of the most haunted houses in the world. Built in the 19th century, commissioned by the Finney family, specifically Michael C. Finney, who bought two next door plots to build homes on. And the first that was built would become 508, the Sallie House, and next door is 504 North 2nd Street. We're going to go through the history of the house and the people that live there, but first let's discuss the story of what is supposed to be the source of all the problems in the house and where it gets its name. Now, the story is that one night a mother brings her child to the Sallie House, which is home to the doctor. We think the doctor is Charles Finney. We'll get into that. And the child is suffering from severe abdominal pains, which the doctor believes is appendicitis. And thinking the appendix is about to burst, he cuts the child, Sallie, before the anaesthesia has had time to take effect. And Sallie is screaming in pain and dies on the table during the operation. It's believed that she didn't really know what was going on, and so her last memory is of this unknown man cutting her, and that is the spirit that haunts this house. Now, actually, there is no evidence of this taking place, and in fact, it's been completely disproved by Deborah Pickman, who we'll talk about more in depth later. So, between 1867 and 1871, the house is built, contracted by MC Finney, that would become 508 North 2nd Street, and it will be owned by the family until 1939. Now, on the 27th of September 1872, MC Finney dies in the house at 10 p.m, leaving his pregnant wife Catherine, known as Kate, and two sons and a daughter. They had lost one son before the age of 2, and then on the 18th of July, 1874, Kate's father dies, probably in the house, though there's nothing to indicate this, but quite often, obviously, I think this is before the era of big hospitals. We know that the doctor often tended to people at home, and therefore, quite often you would be at home when you gave birth and at home when you died. Kate's son, who was born after his father died in May 1873, only lived until September the 29th, 1874. We also don't know where this baby died, but again, possibly in the house. So poor Kate has had a terrible 2 years. She's lost her husband, her child, and her father. And then in 1879, the house that would become 504 North Street this plot was built on by their eldest son, James K. Finney. Now, if you're facing the Sallie House, 508, 504 is to the right. as you look at it. Now, James builds this house, but 2 years later, he moves to St. Louis for work. He's a very successful salesman, and that's where his work is. So he deeds the house over to his mother, Kate. In October 1882, the house is deeded to Mrs. Catherine Bays, and during the same year, Charles C.C. Finney is the middle son of MC and Kate. He works as a bookkeeper for Dr. Holland, and then he becomes his assistant, and the doctor suggests that Charles goes to medical school, and that he does. Charles also is a very talented competitive figure skater, though he'd eventually get banned from competitions, probably for being too good, but he also seems to have a habit of dressing as a woman and entering competitions, female competitions dressed as a woman, and winning those. So that could be why he was banned. And we know that once he qualified, Finney didn't always practice in the house. He had a practice set up with another doctor further in town. But there are records of the family living upstairs and Charles having rooms for work downstairs. So in 1899, on June the 26th, the house that James Finney built at 504 is then deeded to Joanna Barnes, and she's a pregnant single mother of 3. But sadly, she would be institutionalised before she could move in. She gives birth to a boy in July whilst institutionalised. So on the 18th of February 1900, James Finney dies at 10 p.m, same time as his father, but in hospital in Kansas. On the 9th of November 1904, Charles Finney marries Louise, and they move into the house they've bought on the other side of the Sallie House, so on the left-hand side as you are facing it. Now, there have been people living in this house more recently who have experienced things. On the 18th of April 1906, the deed for 504 that James built, that he deeded to his mother, that then goes from Joanna, who's moving to Kansas City, to Agnes M. Finney, MC's daughter, James's youngest sister. On the 17th of February, Charles and Louise have a son called Charles H. Finney. He would also go on to be a doctor. And Charles briefly becomes mayor of the town. Agnes's husband dies in the Sallie House. Kate dies horribly in 504 from gangrene and septicemia. And Agnes dies in the Sallie House in 1939. From 1958 to 1990, Ethel Anderson lives there. She's the ex-wife of Dr. Anderson, and we don't have a lot of accounts. Although, while she's living there, a mysterious fire happens in the nursery with no reason for how it started and for why it doesn't spread. Then from 1990 to 1992, Bobby and Colleen move from 504 next door to 508, the Sallie House. And while they're living there, Heather, their daughter, often plays with an imaginary friend called Sally. And she maintains, obviously, as kids do with imaginary friends, that this friend is real. And later on, she would identify a drawing by Tony Pickman that he drew of a child he saw in the house as Sally, her imaginary friend. So, after 1992, the Pickmans move in. And the Pickmans are a really important part of the house because not only did they experience a lot, but they documented it a lot. And they have done so much investigation into the history of the house, the history of the town. They really have made it their life's work. Now, it's not a huge house. From what I can tell, you go in through the front door, which used to be the back of the house, but is now the front of the house. There is a sitting room, a sort of sitting room that goes into a dining room that then you turn left off the dining room into the kitchen. So the living room and sitting room are sort of one big room divided into two. And then the kitchen is its own separate room. And off the kitchen, you have a door with stairs down to the basement. Opposite the front door are a steep set of stairs. At the top of the stairs, there's a room called the nursery. Next to that is another room. And then at the end of the corridor is the master bedroom. So that's the sort of layout. It's not a huge house. I think it has an attic, though we only know about that from what I can tell from sounds coming from the attic. So the Pickmans move in. They're excited. They have a baby. They are excited to move into a house where there's more space for them to start growing their family. And Deborah, I think, believes in spiritual things. Tony has been brought up a Catholic, so no ghosts existing as far as he's concerned. And within a month, strange things start to happen in the house. Lights go on and off while they're sitting there. Objects move on their own. Disembodied voices. They see the chains on the fan would move in a weird way when the fan wasn't even on. And they think this is strange. But if you're not expecting anything paranormal, obviously, they just put it down to, as strange things. After 6 months, they've been living there for 6 months, and they get home. They've spent the day out with the baby, and they get home, and in the nursery, they find all the teddy bears arranged in a circle on the floor. They think one of them is pulling a prank on the other one. They put the bears back. They think maybe Tony's brother, who lives next door, has come in and played a prank. They get downstairs, having put the toys back, switch the light off, and as they get to the bottom of the stairs, the light switch is back on. They go back upstairs, and some bears are back in the middle of the room, and that really freaks them out. Deborah's just had a baby. Someone, I believe it might be Tony, someone says, maybe it's the ghost of a child that's here. And Deborah feels maternal. She feels bad for this child, and so isn't too worried about it. And in fact, she would experience a lot less than Tony. Tony would hear footsteps going up and down the stairs. He would hear a child giggling. They had cats in the house, so they would rationalise it by, the cats making the noise that sounds like footsteps. Tony said he would lie awake and hear these footsteps going up and down the stairs. Now, it's a very small landing upstairs. You basically have 2 rooms, then a bathroom, then the master bedroom, along this narrow corridor. So he would get up and stand at the top of the stairs, and he said he would feel a cold breeze go through him, and he would hear giggling, but there'd be nothing there. At this point, they would come downstairs and they would find pictures and photographs on the wall, still hanging but turned upside down. And then localised fires start happening. Candles would be lit, wax melted that on candles that had never been lit before, and the wick wouldn't be burnt. So the wick would be fresh, but the wax would be melted. They saw child-sized fingerprints show up in the wax. The plastic would still be on the candle, but the wax was melted. And Deborah was like, maybe it's something to do with heat coming from somewhere, and she tried to recreate it with her hairdryer, but it just didn't have the same effect, and they didn't know what heat could cause this. Things would be burnt from the inside out, like they found one of the baby's dummies, as we call them, pacifiers, burnt, but it appeared to be burnt from the inside out, and the same with a flower that had been on a windowsill in the kitchen. Now, Scott and Forrest from Astonishing Legends did a full interview with the Pickmans, which I'm going to use here for facts, because They did the full interview with them in part 1 of their coverage of the Sallie House. And part of the reason the Pickmans agreed to do this interview was because there is so much out there that isn't fact, and because there are so many paranormal investigators going in and out, experiencing things, getting mediums to tell them what they see, and the facts are diluted, which is why I'm going to be using the info from there, because obviously it's as close as I'm going to get to the sources. So things that happened to Tony and Deborah. Tony would hear loud noises in one room and Deborah would hear nothing. And he would hear things like the EVP that's caught by Astonishing Legends, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. One of the first things that happened to Tony was that he felt a pain and like a bite on the top of his thigh. And so he pulls his trousers down for Deborah to have a look. And there are kid-size teeth marks on the back of his thigh. And this would be the start, really, of this physical activity that is mostly directed at Tony. Deborah is unaffected. One point, Tony's mother is there. She's holding the baby, and the baby made a squeak like it had been pinched. And she tells the entity off, and it then starts to move, I think, a glass vase towards her. Things float in the air in this house. But what's kind of similar to this entity seems very similar to The Shining in that Tony can hear these noises and is scratched a lot, and he starts to fantasize about killing his wife. He has vivid dreams about slitting her throat, and he said if he was away from the house for a bit, when he'd come back, he'd have the feeling of, we need to leave this house, we need to get out of here. But the longer he stayed at the house, that feeling became she has to get out, and that he never wanted to leave the house. And these, he was really concerned, and he had this one experience where he gets out a kitchen knife. He sees a cat drinking milk and then blacks out. He has no memory of what happens next. And when he gets home later that day, brace yourselves, sorry. He sees they find the cat stabbed to the worktop in the kitchen. And he loves animals. They have always had cats. He has no memory of doing it, but he says it must have been me. And, he's very concerned for Deborah. And he says, I said to her, it's not going to end well. And I fear it's not going to end well for you. But she is unaffected by this. So one day when he's in the house on his own, he gets thrown against the stairs and 3 banisters are broken. And it's this actually that makes Deborah snap out of it, and she makes the decision to leave. And after they leave, Tony finds himself back at the house, barefoot in the snow, standing outside the house. This is years after they've moved out, and he doesn't know how he got there. And he says that he always has this pull back to the house. And a lot of people who have been to the Sallie House say this. Some people experience nothing, but some people who do experience things feel this pull, like they must go back to the house, which must be really scary. Now, Tony, as I said, was brought up a Catholic. He was a skeptic. He made sure he got checked out for mental issues, anything that could be causing these feelings. And actually, if you see them interviewed together, they're a very tactile, loving couple. So it must have been very out of character for him to want to do away with his wife. And he actually was diagnosed with having PTSD from the house and had to have therapy for it because of what he experienced there. I would also say that the Sallie House has been tested for radon and carbon monoxide. This is one of the first things that I thought about when I first started researching this. And I honestly thought this was going to have to be a mini-sode because it would be too short. Because I was like, yeah, it's a haunted house. Some people see stuff, some people don't. Yeah. So my thing is there anything that is going to cause people to feel unwell? Undetectable gases or electromagnetic things that are going to make humans feel unwell, and they'll put that down to spiritual activity, but in fact it's something in the house. But obviously there are lots of people who have also thought that, and it has been checked and there is nothing there. A lot of people feel there's a presence in the basement, and indeed a pentagram was found on the floor there by the owner when he bought the house. And basements, obviously there's household stuff there, there's boilers, there's the air conditioning unit, I think, and I always think are those machines and units giving off something that makes humans feel unwell. But these have all been checked and there's nothing. So some people feel there's a horrible presence in the basement. Some people don't feel anything at all. One medium said that she had the image of a woman who had died, breaking her neck, falling down the basement stairs. But actually, from what I can tell from Deborah Pickman's research, there's no evidence that this happened. And that's what I mean. There's lots of mediums that have gone to the house and feel different energies and feel a bad energy. From what I can tell, there seems to be a few different entities in the house. Some fine, some not so good. Weirdly, Deborah says that there's a lot of similarities between the Sallie House and the house where the Fazilla axe murders took place. And Tony said he had a real shock because he was flicking through a true crime book, I believe. It was a true crime book. And he saw a picture of the lady the lady who'd found the bodies from the axe murders. And he said that looks exactly like the woman I have seen upstairs. And so Tony sees that lady once. He also sees this little girl in the kitchen. He says he goes into the kitchen, he gets a glass out of the cupboard, he pours himself some orange juice, he turns around and there's a little girl standing in the kitchen. And he completely freaks out, and he's very creative. He draws a picture of what he's seen. This picture is then recognised as the child who lived there before them as her imaginary friend Sallie. Now, another toddler has also visited the house and was found in this cupboard where a lot of people feel uneasy and unwell and sick and headachy. And this toddler was visiting the house. It disappeared. They find it sitting in this cupboard playing with the dolls and saying, and talking, and they say, "Darling, who are you talking to?" And they say, "My friend right here." So there does seem to be this child called Sallie present in the house. Perhaps not the Sallie of the myth about the appendicitis, but that's what the imaginary friend was called. That is, that's a name that seems to keep coming up over and over again. Now, what's really horrible is that after they moved, the Pickmans still experience things, specifically Tony Pickman. Tony has caught fire in front of his children while lying asleep on his sofa. They have seen a knife come through from the kitchen towards Tony and cut through his shirt enough to scratch and leave a mark on his skin and then throw itself at the wall. This has happened in front of their children. And he says that these things will happen if there's a particularly intense investigation going on at the Sallie House at the time. Something will happen to him at their new house. One thing that happens a lot is people hear crying from the attic. And while the Pickmans are there, they eventually seek support. They get an exorcism done. They get approached by lots of paranormal people, and they eventually do a sightings episode. And this is all on YouTube. So if you're interested in this, you can watch the full sightings episode. It looks like it's ancient, but it's from the 90s, which feels like yesterday until you look at it on the telly. Now, throughout this sightings episode, Tony Pickman is scratched whilst continuously being filmed. You just see scratches appearing. He has scratches on his chest and his stomach. Scratches appear on his face in front of one of the presenters. They take Peter James, who is a renowned psychic, to the house. And as soon as he arrives, obviously this is where I get very cynical. He doesn't know where he's being taken. He doesn't know what's going on. And it is the 90s, so there's not a lot of internet. And there's not a lot of... The Pickmans are... There isn't the history of the house available as there is now, as it being really haunted. The Pickmans are the people who really are documenting and experiencing this. So, but he arrives, he gets out of the car, and he immediately says, there's a little girl standing at the window. He then gets into the house and he says, there's a little girl standing right there. And he talks, and he does talk like he's talking to a little girl. He goes, come on, Sally. And he says, her name's Sally. At the time, I don't believe it was called the Sallie House. I think it's called 508 North 2nd Street. So he was just like, come on, Sally. Hi, Sally. She's up at the top of the stairs. So they do this walk around the house. And when they get to the top of the house, Peter James feels resistance in the doorway of the master bedroom. He says something really doesn't want me to go in there. And he feels his face starting to burn. And Tony then goes, oh, no, and starts to back out. And I think Peter James at the time thinks that Tony's scared. So he's like, oh, no, Tony, it's fine. But you can see Deborah untucking and lifting up Tony's shirt. And on on Tony's back is scratched the initials MC. And they're properly bleeding. And unless it's very cleverly edited for the 90s, I don't know how they would have got it. He's wearing a white shirt. It's a lot of white in the 90s. He's wearing a white shirt. I don't know how he would have pre-scratched himself and not got blood on his shirt. So then afterwards, they all take 5 minutes to calm down. Peter James has this burning feeling on his face, and they're walking down the stairs, and the sound man notices that the back of Tony's shirt just catches on fire. It's not caught on camera. And the sound man obviously is the sound man. He's not a presenter, he's not a medium or anything, but he was just walking behind Tony down the stairs and was like, your shirt's on fire. Peter James at one point gets an electric shock on his hand, and then they do a vigil that just is Tony getting scratched the whole time. Also, they get a sound on one of their recordings that they send it off to two sound engineers to analyze, and both come back saying that it sounds like something magnetic. It's at a frequency that's low enough that humans can't make that noise. So it's a non-human noise. It's a very strange noise. So whilst they're doing this sightings, a previous resident recognizes the house and comes back, and she's the mother whose daughter had the imaginary friend. And she comes in and she says that one time she was walking past the nursery to go downstairs, and she sees a fire around the windowsill. But she was like, there's no electrical outlets, there's no electricity in that wall. There's no way that fire could have started, and why didn't it spread? The fires that start in the house never spread. There's carpets in every room. There's obviously soft furnishings. There's curtains. There's net curtains. This fire never spreads. Everyone who's lived there feels eerie cold spots, almost drafts. the TV goes on and off, the electricity goes on and off, the Hoover goes on and off. The quite often Maria Miller, I believe she's called, she's sort of like the gatekeeper of the house. She doesn't own the house, but she is involved in the tourism of the town, and she is in charge of the Sallie House. And she says sometimes she'll arrive, she'll unlock the door, and the radio will be on. And she always says, "Yep, Sallie loves music, so." Quite often she'll switch the radio on. She also says that sometimes she arrives and feels nothing. You know, she goes in, she gets ready for visitors or whatever it is. And sometimes she goes in and she is like, there's a really heavy feeling. And I just leave thinking, okay, I'm not supposed to be in there today. The last thing that happened to the Pickmans, I mean, there's loads of stuff that happens to Pickmans, but one thing that's very interesting, because there's a photograph of it, is Tony is sitting with his brother in the sitting room downstairs, and they have this TV table. It's a drop leaf TV table, and there's a TV sitting on it, and then the leaves are up, and on, I think it's the left hand leaf, there's a teddy bear. And I think Tony's brother says something like, "Come on then, I'm going to take a photograph, and if you're really here, do something with that bear." And he clicks the camera, pre iPhone days. And the bear spins. And so he's got a picture of this bear. You can't really see it's a bear. It's in motion, but you can see that everything around it has stopped. So obviously the Pickmans move out when Tony falls. I think he falls partly down the stairs or nearly down the stairs. And these fantasies about killing his wife. So they move out. But now I want to mention the Astonishing Legends podcast, because it's 4 parts. I think the first one's 4 hours, the second one's 2 hours, the third one I think is 3 hours, the next one is 2 hours. There's a lot. They did so much, and as they say, they did a lot. They hadn't planned really to even do a big episode on it. They thought they were going to go here. They didn't really have time. They were there for something else. They were going to go there, have a look around and leave, but they experienced something so much that they did all this work on it. So it really is worth a listen if you are interested in this story and want to hear interviews with the owner of the house, Maria, the manager, the Pickmans, all of that, because they've done such an incredible job. But I really want to mention it because Scott Philbrooks had an experience in the house, and I don't think it's exaggerating to say that it was a life-changing experience. They're there for the Amelia Earhart convention. His 9-year-old son is with him. The whole crew is there. They pull up to the house, and his 9-year-old son, who, knows a bit about what they do, but doesn't listen to any of the spooky stuff. A bit like my son, who's always like, "You should do a show on vampires." But he's not going to listen to it until he's old enough. I don't like him looking at what I'm reading for research. But they arrive, they pull up at the house, and his 9-year-old son, within seconds, looks at his dad and says, "I don't want to go in there." And so he waits in the car, and the other lot go in to investigate. Now, Scott and another team member feel real pressure in one of the upstairs rooms, and Scott's son says he needs the loo, and Scott doesn't want to send him in to the house. So he drives him back to the hotel, and he thinks, right, I'm going to get our EVP recorder, because we've obviously got more time at the house than I thought. So he picks it up, and they do an EVP upstairs. And when they're doing this EVP, which I believe is it's either in the nursery or the room next to it that has that little walk-in cupboard bit. So they're sitting there, and Tess, their researcher, who has been feeling fine beforehand, she says as soon as they press the record button, she starts to feel really terrible. And she's also one person that, since being there, she says when she talks about it, when she speaks about it, she feels nauseous. She has this awful feeling, and she hears this voice, and she describes it as being like if someone sent a text message to her head. And she said, "Did anyone else hear that?" And everyone was like, "No." But she heard someone say "why" in her head in a response to a question. They then leave the recorder on in the room. Scott says he wants to leave the recorder on in the closed room to see if it picks up on anything. So They all go downstairs. Scott says, and you can hear him on the tape, if there's anyone here who wants to share a message, now's your time. I'm leaving this switched on for 5 minutes. Then they all go downstairs. They sit in a room, not underneath that room, further away. They all go and sit, and he's sitting there timing it on his watch for 5 minutes. And what shows up on the recording after 5 minutes so affected Scott that he left the house and refused to go back in. He felt that it was directed at him. He just was horrified by what he heard. You can find this and listen to it on the Astonishing Websites podcast website, but I think it's also all over YouTube because I definitely had heard it before. But it sounds like a really enraged, screaming, guttural roaring, and it goes on for 2 minutes. And some people can hear voice of like words, obviously not actual words, but like it's speaking words. And I would say, as Scott says, if you do go and listen to it, listen with caution. It sounds really horrible to me, but I'm not that affected by it. I'll let you know at 10 o'clock tonight when I'm on my own, my very old house. But obviously what is in this house and listening to this has really affected some people. So listen with caution. I don't think it's a must listen because it is horrible. But yeah, it's just like this guttural stop roaring. It's not like, I feel like if it was more continuous, I'd be more tempted to be like, oh, is it a bug that's landed on the microphone and is making a really horrible noise? It literally is like it pauses for breath and then starts up again. Now, when Tony Pickford hears this recording, he says that sounds like what he would hear, that Deborah wouldn't hear. And it's very loud. So he would always be kind of mesmerised as to how Deborah couldn't have heard what he heard. So, I mean, over the years, many people have lived at the Sallie House, but people don't live there now. Now you can book to go and visit. You can actually book to stay overnight. There are lots of paranormal investigations going on there all the time. As I say, people experience different things. Some people go and experience nothing. Some people hear doors opening and closing on their own, disembodied voices, giggling seems to be like kids giggling seems to be a big thing. Some people see this older woman standing upstairs, objects move without explanation. There seems to be things that float, which I'm always very dubious of, but that has happened. So obviously, despite many reports of paranormal activity at the Sallie House, skeptics remain unconvinced, and they argue that the experiences could easily be explained by natural phenomena or psychological factors. I mean, I've definitely been places where I haven't wanted to go in. I've definitely been places where there are rooms that I don't want to enter. I grew up in a house with voices. So it's not that I am skeptical, it's that I am very much a fan of as much information and as much debunking as possible. And I'm very convinced that some people go to the Sallie House and feel nothing. And I can fully imagine that some people go there and feel awful. And some people go into the basement and feel awful. And interestingly, Astonishing Legends guys, they all went into the basement and felt nothing. So if there is something there, and I think there probably is, it seems to be this entity that moves around the house and perhaps picks who it can interact with. And it can't interact with everyone or doesn't choose to interact with everyone. But the experiences that people have had are really extreme. And the fact that Tony Pickford is still targeted, the thing with the knife is the stuff of nightmares. And what seems to be a running theme about the Sallie House is that it's not wanting to harm them necessarily, it's more mental manipulation. Even I made my husband watch Sam and Colby YouTubers. I mean, I wanted to mother them so badly. Watched them do a nighttime vigil paranormal doodah there, and it's hard to tell if they experienced anything because there's just a lot of screaming well, not screaming, manly, "Ugh." They definitely heard stuff, but I always think how much of that is, I would get, you get freaked out if you're in the dark and your friend starts getting jumpy. Of course you get jumpy. But even they said at one point, like, it feels, anything that they experienced, even if it was that fearful feeling, they were like, it feels more like being mentally messed with. And if you think about the scratching that happened to Tony, and it has happened to other people who have visited, these scratches appearing from nowhere. And the scratches appearing from nowhere they get pretty deep. Some of them, it looks like, someone's raked their nails and it's a welt that's risen up and a few pricks of blood. Some of them are really deep. I would say, like, would be hard to cause with nails. But yeah, it seems to be more torment than actual physical difficulty. That if that knife is hovering through the air to slice Tony's shirt, could it not therefore kill him? And he says, like, I catch on fire, but it could easily then set the house on fire while we're in there. And I think a few people who've lived there have said, like, why does it not just, we worry about the fire and we worry about the house catching on fire while we're in there, but it doesn't seem to happen. It's just these localized weird heat things. The Sallie House remains a popular destination for those interested in the paranormal. It's a place where the veil between this world and the next world seems to be particularly thin, and where the mysteries of the universe are still waiting to be uncovered. And that is the story, very briefly and basically, of the Sallie House. I feel like I've done a very shonky, sped up job, having listened to about 8 hours of grown-up men talking about it in depth. But yeah, I'm not sure if I look at it, I get a feeling, but I don't know if I get a feeling because I've done all this research on it. I don't know if I was ever in Kansas, whether I would go. I don't know. I really don't like the fact that a couple of people have said that they feel this pull back to the house, and Tony Pickford has turned up, found himself in front of the house with no idea how he got there. I really don't like that. I really don't like the thought of welcoming that into my life, if you know what I mean. And I'd love to know what you think. Do you have my mum was like, I want you to do more haunted stuff in the UK. And I was like, but it's, apart from Borley Rectory, there's very little good evidence of stuff in the UK. If you know of somewhere, let me know, because a lot of them would be mini-sode material, but not necessarily full episode material. I absolutely love seeing you in your t-shirts. So if you haven't got one, they're not very expensive, if I do say so myself. And they're super comfy and ethically sourced and made. And that's why they took so long, because I was very picky about it. I hope you're having a good Monday and you enjoyed this episode. You can contact me on themondaynightrevue@gmail.com. You can find me on social media at The Monday Night Review. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seats before you drive.